Hello everyone, and welcome to our session today. I'm Audra Mitchell from the Massy Learning Institute, and I'm your host for today's session. Today's webinar is entitled An Introduction to ESG and its Relevance to Massy. And this provides us with an opportunity to educate and create an awareness about this important global topic. We will learn about the three pillars of ESG: environmental, social, and governance. We'll learn about the framework that exists and how it's incorporated into our businesses, and also how we report on it. Because as we've been reading and learning, incorporating ESG into our businesses is a goal for all organizations for long-term sustainability for our people, our planet, purpose, and profit. Secondly, you will hear about Massy's journey and our context in regards to ESG. As this is such an important topic, we have allocated 90 minutes for today's webinar, and we encourage you to engage with us by commenting in the chat, posting your questions, which we will handle after our presentation. We want to remind you that when posting your questions, please indicate the panelists to whom your question is addressed, as that will greatly assist us in moderating this aspect of our webinar. Please note that this session will be recorded and will be made available at a later date on the Massy Learning Institute website, as well as on our YouTube channel. We encourage you to leave a comment so we can get your feedback. So now, without further ado, let me welcome and introduce our panelists. Firstly, we have Ms. Rachel Welch-Phillips, partner at Dentons Delaney. She's the Corporate Commercial Head of ESG and Sustainable Finance. Welcome, Rachel. We also have Ms. Wendy Kerry, Senior Vice President, Corporate Governance and Corporate Secretary, Massy Limited. And last, but certainly by no means least, Ms. Anjan McLean, Vice President and Group Chief Risk Officer of Massy Limited. So we welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. At this point, I would like to invite Ms. Wendy Kerry to start us off by setting the context for today's discussion on ESG and its relation to Massy. Wendy, over to you.
Thank you, Audra. Good morning, everyone. I just want to start off by saying, it is quite a privilege to be here talking about ESG with Rachel, who is an expert in her field, and Jen, who's always such a pleasure to work with, and to use this Massy Learning Institute platform. So thanks, Audra, for inviting us and bringing us all together here today. My job is an easy one today, just to give some introductory comments on where Massy is on its ESG journey, and some thoughts, and hopefully in our Q&A, hear some thoughts from you on where we would like to go. We have some thoughts where we would like to go that's very much aligned to our purpose, but we'd like to hear some more from you, our employees, because we want to create this with you. So, although ESG as a term is relatively new, Massy has been on its ESG journey, I would say, for at least 10 years without the term ESG being recognized as such. Or we've been on this journey without knowing that this would evolve into this new, seemingly at times almost difficult to grapple with phenomenon. Rachel will talk to you a little bit about what ESG is, what it's not. But some of you may remember concepts that we spoke of since 2013, like conscious capitalism, servant leadership, and everybody matters. So by 2014, we established new Massy values. So this is the journey continuing, including love and care. And by 2022, we evolved our vision statement to a global force for good, an investment holding company with a Caribbean heart. And we believe that the evolution of who we are as Massy became our starting point for ESG. We all started, and the work continues with our leadership to develop a more conscious awareness of ourselves and what we want to create for our employees, for our customers, for our investors, our shareholders, and more now for our communities and the environment. We have seen that even before ESG, I like to say BESG, that the Massy Group made efforts in various areas to take care of the environment in which we operate. And this is something that is growing. It's still a growing part of our DNA. But some of these initiatives included recycling initiatives, teaching farmers how to operate with more sustainable practices. Some of you may have heard of Nudge, the social enterprise powered by Massy. Nudge invested $100,000 US in a company called Algos Organics, which is a biotech company from St. Lucia that harvests sargassum seaweed to produce a biostimulant. And many of our employees across the group are also doing their part as individuals, and we could not be prouder of them. Massy Motors Colombia, the Medellin office, for example, employees started on their own a personal campaign, a personal challenge called Eco Retos, in which employees make personal pledges to recycle or to reduce their use of plastic bottles for bottled water. In this financial year, 2023, the Massy Holdings Board, for the first time, included ESG in its board charter and formalized its responsibility for ESG oversight. However, all our employees must continue to be engaged and step by step, working to make ESG meaningful to us, bespoke and tailored to Massy. For our impact must be that as a force for good on our people, our businesses, our industries, our communities, and our planet. So Massy is currently at a stage of building a greater awareness around ESG. That's where we are right now. And that's what Rachel is here to help us with. But this is also happening at a time where ESG is still evolving and at a time where we are all invited to influence how this evolves and to influence our impact on each other, our planet, and our communities. So as we build awareness, we invite all group employees to continue to build this story about us, about who we are, and about the impact that we want to leave on our planet and on the people that we work with and live with. So for Massy, ESG is about CAREING. It is one of our values, and ESG must proceed, on a sort of a values-based approach to it, rather than a technical compliance approach. We know that part is coming, but for it to really be meaningful, people do have to care. And we know who the Massy family is. Caring lives in who we are, a force for good. It lives in our Caribbean hearts. And some of you may have heard of Massy growing from being a conscious organization, but growing now to being a healing organization. And we ran various workshops this year across Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Barbados, where we discussed this and what it looks like for our Massy people. And now, as we declare as a company, as a group, ourselves a healing organization, it's still, what exactly does that mean? Consciousness says that we're aware of our impact. Healing goes further. It goes further. Healing speaks to sustainability. It is the healing of people. It is the healing of the planet. It is being good stewards for future generations. So ESG, or as Massy likes to call it, CARE, is part of our DNA. And we are on the best platform to creating something truly exceptional. I really believe that. And I will now hand you over to Rachel, who is here to help us on our journey to better understand what ESG is, how do we build it into our organization, and how do we comply and report on it. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Wendy, and thank you, Audra. And thank you to the Massy family for having me here today to be a part of your ESG journey. It is a real honor and privilege to share with you a topic that is a true passion area of mine. So as my description suggests, I am a lawyer. I was trained in the UK, and part of my legal journey has always been a focus on sustainability and the environment. So prior to my law degree, I obtained a BA and an MPhil in environmental policy and matters of sustainability. That I've carried with me throughout my career. So really and truly, I have been an ESG practitioner for about, I'm afraid to say now, but about 13 years. So the benefit of having done this across Europe, where the regulatory landscape is more developed, is that I've seen the hurdles that companies had to jump. I've seen the environments that they've had to develop in order to get this right. And I'm very honored to be able to bring some of that learning to the Caribbean and assist companies like Massy in their ESG journey and with their ESG goals. So with that in mind, let's jump straight into what our agenda is for today. So today we are going to be discussing what ESG is, as well as what it is not, the key terms and definitions often circulating in this space, as well as what is the journey like to incorporating ESG principles and objectives into your organization. We'll then touch very briefly on disclosure and reporting and what that looks like within an ESG framework, and then of course, how we keep the journey continuing. So how do we ensure that our ESG journey is one of ongoing progress, improvements, and compliance? So with all that in mind, let us jump right in. So here is the definition that I have developed for what ESG is about and the essence of it. So ESG has as its core the objective of the transparent disclosure of the impact of your operations on people and the planet, and assessing and addressing this impact. So really, sometimes I like to toss the term ESG out the window a little bit and just refer to impact on people and the planet. How a company operates, its governance, and the impact it has on the environment and societies is really all about what is the company doing to make its money, and how is its revenue generation affecting the planet that we all live on and the people that are affected by the operation. So really, ESG is a very all-encompassing and very, very comprehensive concept. What we are asking companies to do in enacting an ESG framework is basically to bear ESG principles in mind in all stages of operation, whether it be risk assessment, strategy development, development of operational processes, or its reporting and audit. Really, ESG needs to fall as somewhat of an umbrella over a company's operation. So with that in mind, what is ESG not? So ESG is a framework, so it is a framework of risk assessment and impact considerations. It is not your philanthropic endeavors in and of themselves, and it is also not your marketing strategy. Now, both these aspects of a company's operations can be included in an ESG framework and along an ESG journey. However, they have to be integrally tied to how the business is making money. For example, a project will sit in the philanthropic space if it is addressing a societal issue or concern that is not tied to its operations. It's still doing good, it is still of extreme societal value and importance, but it would not be embedded into the ESG framework. The ESG framework cannot be separated from the operations of the business. So what we tend to see when clients roll out an ESG framework is that we often see a redirection of both philanthropic funding and of marketing strategy, where the company realizes and recognizes the value of addressing the direct impact of how it makes its money. So there are several sustainability terms that are often thrown about that I think it's worth taking a moment to clarify, because ESG is very distinct from each of these things. Now, we've touched on corporate social responsibility already, but another term that we often hear is circular economy. The circular economy speaks to the use, reuse, recycling, and reduction of waste. So what the circular economy looks at is how can we extract the maximum value from materials that are used in the processes that we derive value from. So whether that is manufacturing, whether that is anything, carpentry, chemical production, whatever it might be, the consideration of the life cycle of the input materials is what circular economy is speaking to. So the objective of circular economy is really and truly to reduce waste and maximize the value derived from material inputs. The just transition is another term that's often used in the sustainability space. And what that is speaking to is the transition from fossil fuels to more renewable energy sources. So the just transition has at its core the shift of energy. However, what it takes into consideration is the equitable transition away from fossil fuels. So what that will bear in mind is very much the societal and governance aspects of how we move the global economy away from fossil fuels and into a more renewable space. Greenwashing is a term that is often thrown around as well, often with a bit of fear. So greenwashing speaks to the risk of painting a project or an initiative or an objective as green when in fact it does not achieve environmentally positive outcomes. Now, greenwashing is a very, very sensitive area because this really emphasizes the importance of understanding terms before you use them, particularly in the marketing space. If a company is going to profess to do something in a green way, it really has to be able to substantiate that. In the Caribbean, where we have a less litigious environment than is seen in North America, which is where we see a lot more companies being sued for greenwashing allegations, in the Caribbean, it may not be as likely that this will reach a court environment. However, given the ease of access of sharing of information through social media channels and the like, what ends up happening is reputational damage is a real risk of greenwashing in our environment. So what people like to term cancel culture now, where a company gains a reputation for certain behaviors that can be very, very difficult to rectify. So greenwashing is something that in this space, it needs to be very, very front of mind to ensure that companies do not often inadvertently, it is often done without malice, however, inadvertently falling at the risk of being accused of greenwashing. The triple bottom line is one that is evolving. So the triple bottom line is people, planet, and profit. It is the sustainability linked term for turning a company's minds to more than just the financial bottom line. It's evolving even further now into what we call a quadruple bottom line, which looks at people, planet, profit, and purpose. The purpose element is one I think is particularly relevant in the Massy context, as Massy have dedicated substantial time and resource to developing cultural purpose. So ensuring that the company has an ethos and a principle of how it operates that is aligned with a very clear purpose. The reason this is often included in the quadruple bottom line is that the purpose elements are often where you capture good governance practices. So again, this is something that Massy has had front of mind for quite a long time, but it really is an integral part of an ESG framework. I like to view ESG as a bit of a tree. The roots of the tree are good governance. If the roots are strong and healthy, the environmental and social fruit that the tree will bear will also be healthy and prosperous. However, if the root is bad and the governance practices are not strong or positive, then it is very, very difficult to achieve positive outcomes in the environmental and social impact. Therefore, good governance, being the root, is of extreme importance, and this is why we now refer often to the quadruple bottom line of people, planet, profit, and purpose. So the last term that gets thrown around occasionally is one called ecocide. That has a very strong link to environment, and it is a term that's used often by environmental groups when accusing a company of damaging the environment irreparably. So ecocide, again, it's a space where you don't want that word affiliated with your operation and what you're up to, but it is very, very environmentally focused, and it is not speaking to the wider risk framework that ESG speaks to. So let's go a step further and take a look at what ESG is about. So what are we speaking of when we speak of the environmental, social, and governance impacts of a business's operation? Well, the environment pillar is one that is a little better understood in the community. We are speaking to climate change, both adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. We are speaking to biodiversity. We are speaking to resource use and management. We're talking about pollution, waste management, where money is invested and how it is invested in terms of its impact on the environment. So financial institutions, for example, will be looking at their portfolios. What are we putting our money into, and what is the environmental impact of that spend? Social tends to look at how the organization treats the members of its community. Now, community is a very broad concept when it comes to business. If you think about who the stakeholders are that are impacted by an operation, it is not limited to employees and customers or shareholders, which tend to be the first stakeholder that is named in a listing. It includes the communities affected by the places in which the company does business. For example, those who live near the warehouses, or those who might sit close to the manufacturing plants, or those who are third-party suppliers in the procurement chain of the company. These are all people whose impact, who are impacted by the business. So the business needs to bear in mind what its impact is on the people affected by its operations, as well as the planet. So again, you're looking at labor practices, procurement practices, health and safety practices, customer relations, equitable practices, etc. So lastly, governance. Again, we've spoken on this briefly already, but what are we looking at when we're looking at good governance practices? We're essentially looking at how a company makes decisions. Who makes those decisions, why those decisions are made, and what systems are in place for checks and balances to ensure that the company is deploying independent, transparent, accountable, and reputable governance practices. This includes policies such as anti-money laundering, anti-bribery, anti-corruption, counter-terrorism finance, etc., etc. But it also includes aspects of governance such as cybersecurity, how a company protects its data, its customers' data, third-party data and information, how it uses it and deploys it in its own practices. So data has a huge role to play in good governance. We also look at the transparency and accountability of the executive practices, the clarity of the leadership structures, the remuneration, and the understanding of promotional policies, etc. So as Phil Harding, the archaeologist, says it, and I quite enjoy this phrase because I think it really does speak to that tree concept I described earlier. Without environmental sustainability, economic stability and social cohesion cannot be achieved. So the interdependency of these pillars is really paramount. So let's look at why it matters. Why are we here to discuss ESG? Why has this become something that is worth an entire webinar on the Massy Learning Institute platform? Well, let's have a look at what some of the data has revealed. In 2012, the World Economic Forum ran its Global Risk Perception Survey. That survey is a survey of the investment community and financial community as a whole, speaking to what the key risk factors are for the global economy. So here we see in 2012 that major systemic financial failure was at the top. Again, if we think back to what was happening around 2012, we can understand why that might be, as that was when we had that economic recession. Water supply crises, food shortage crises, those are also very high up. But again, we turn to market forces. chronic fiscal imbalances, and volatility in energy and agriculture prices. So we're seeing a real dominance of the financial and criteria in assessing risk for the global economy. That was in 2012. Now we look at 2021 to 2022, what that survey has revealed, and we see an overwhelming predominance of the E, the S, and the G, and very little from the financial element. So now we're seeing debt crises falling ninth in the list of risks as perceived by the investment community. And what we're seeing is a predominance of environmental impacts as the largest risk to the global economy. Now, these would be risks to business, risks to governments, risks to the entire operation of our society and fabric of it as we have built it. So climate action failure and extreme weather, social impacts are also coming to the fore. Infectious diseases, again, very clear why that would be very present in 2021 to 2022's survey, given the COVID-19 pandemic and the damage that that caused. So again, we are seeing the global economy changing to this realization that actually the risks we need to account for are no longer the traditional risks of the era of industrialization, which really centered on financial risk. So why does that matter? Why does it matter that the global community is looking at this? Well, this is going to shape and paint how we continue to develop our economy. Our global economy is now going to be premised on new risks. We are now going to be preparing to face very new challenges that are going to require companies to do things differently. So what are some of the opportunities and risks that arise from an ESG strategy in business? Well, the opportunities are very clear. The financial and cost efficiency benefits to a company of truly understanding and assessing what its resource uses are, what its impacts are, what its employee satisfaction is, what its customer satisfaction is. Asking the right questions in all of those categories that we saw on a few slides ago is giving the company really good insight into how it can optimize its operations. So that is probably the key benefit to an ESG strategy is the company does a deep dive that lets it get to know itself much better. The reputational benefits are also there. A company that understands its impact can then address it. And the reputational impact of that is that the positive impacts of addressing it will be felt by the stakeholders, but also you can market that, right? It's not that ESG is not marketable. It should absolutely be marketed, and it should be shared and communicated to the wider community that this is something the company has put at its core. You're also looking at first mover advantage. ESG is still in its very nascent stages in the Caribbean, and we are still not a regulated environment in this space. Therefore, the first mover advantage is for a company like Massy to be seen as doing the right thing for the right reasons before anybody else. And any economist will tell you the competitive advantage brought from that is quite significant. When you look at partnership opportunities, a whole new world opens up because let's remember that though the Caribbean is unregulated, North America and Europe are increasingly regulated in this space. We're also seeing it happen across East Asia at very, very rapid speeds, where we're seeing stock exchanges, for example, placing ESG disclosure requirements on its listed companies. We're seeing governments mandate reporting on impact on people on the planet from its companies. This is happening across Europe at great speed. What we're seeing in North America is a real focus on climate and understanding the impact of operations, a company's operations on climate change. Partnerships with companies who operate in those regulated environments will require that us in the Caribbean, that we can also contribute to their compliance. In the US, for example, the scope of the reporting requirements are going to include, as of now, Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are carbon emissions that are derived from your supply chain. So where a Caribbean company is contributing to a process or an operation of an American company, they will also be required to disclose their carbon emissions in order for that American company to be compliant with its regulatory environment. So the knock-on effects of what's happening around us are going to be felt in the Caribbean, probably long before we actually regulate ourselves. What that means is those companies that get on board and get compliant and deploy ESG strategies and gather ESG impact data will be in a prime position to be selected by international players as partners and members of their supply chain. So this also speaks to regional and international growth opportunities. If we can stay compliant in the Caribbean with best practice outside of the Caribbean, then that increases the opportunity for our companies to be very present in those global environments. We can also look at favorable financing opportunities. There is a huge amount of liquidity that's being released across the world in order to achieve sustainable and ESG-related objectives. Accessing that financing requires that a company have certain data available and disclosures in place, as well as a strategy for how it's addressing the impact it's having on people and the planet. Financing that is available along ESG and social impact investment lines is often very favorable financing. What that means is that the premiums on the interest tend to be lower. Access in general is just a a huge benefit to having an ESG strategy, because the access it gives you to other networks, to global networks, through those partnerships, through the favorable financing, through the access to opportunity regionally and internationally, is truly substantial. Now, what are some of the risks that arise from deploying an ESG strategy and perhaps not doing so comprehensively, accurately, or appropriately? Well, greenwashing we've already discussed. If a company chooses to market that certain things are being done in the ESG space that in fact are not fully substantiated by data, because again, ESG is very premised on data, then the greenwashing risk is a serious one, reputationally in particular in our region. There are also non-compliance risks. So as we discussed, a lot of these are emerging outside of our region as of right now, because our regulatory environment is still not present in the ESG space. However, being non-compliant with regimes outside of our region will limit our ability to participate in those markets. Credit ratings are increasingly taking into account a company's responsiveness to ESG factors. So whether a company is aware or capable of addressing the risks that emerge from climate change to its business, the risks that emerge from changes in our social economy, and risks that affect governance, such as bribery and corruption and financing of terrorism. If these things are not seen to be robustly addressed by a company, it could affect their credit rating and as a result affect their access to financing. The largest credit rating agencies in the world, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, they have all adopted ESG factors in assessing risk now, both nationally and for the private sector. Another risk that emerges from an ESG framework is that companies have a tendency to focus on the real tangible outcomes and the quantifiable outcomes of the E and the S to the detriment of the G. Now, this is not something that I see being problematic for Massy, because Massy has the governance aspect far, far more developed than most companies in the region. However, sidelining governance is a real risk. Sidelining governance, what that risks doing is, as mentioned before, poisoning the fruit of the tree. So if the governance is not solid, then the gains that could be available to the company from environmental and social impact addressing, those can be undone. Those can be undone if, for example, the company's cybersecurity policy is not robust, if stakeholder trust is lost based on how the company manages its data or makes its decisions or structures its governance. So sidelining governance is something that companies really need to be careful not to do. As discussed, cybersecurity, again, data and its management is integral to stakeholder trust. Not deploying an ESG strategy also makes the company quite unattractive for collaboration. Even in an unregulated environment, companies do not want to take the risk of partnering with other companies that could be seen to be reputationally damaging. So again, the opportunity for collaboration and partnerships is really great when an ESG framework is present. Lastly, and this links to the first point that was made on optimization of an organization, If an ESG strategy is not deployed or an ESG framework is not undertaken for the company to truly understand its impact, then what it's at risk of is inefficient management. You see great wastage of both finance and resource if the company has not had the opportunity to take a deep dive into how it's using its resources, how it's managing its people, how it's deploying its operational processes, and how those can improve. So let's jump right ahead into a bit of a toolkit. This toolkit provides 5 practical steps for integrating ESG into an organization. As we go step by step, we'll have a discussion around what an employee and a member of staff can do regardless of where they sit in the organization. How can they contribute to the ESG culture of the organization? So the first step is the one I call the flashlight. The flashlight is really shining a light on what matters. So as a company, the company sits down, and usually at the highest levels of the company first, the company asks itself, what do we want to achieve? What are we trying to enlighten ourselves on? This involves both a process of education, but also a process of discussion of, do we truly understand where our impact is on people and the planet? Now, buy-in from the leadership is a very important component to a successful ESG strategy. Now, buy-in is not lip service. Buy-in is not limited to messaging or communication. Buy-in has to be followed by concrete and targeted action. That is what buy-in is all about. So buy-in from the leadership who agree on the values and vision of the company is the kickstart to an ESG journey. That commitment from the top that drives performance is a commitment not just to the messaging, but it's a commitment to the action. It allocates resource, it communicates clearly, and it involves the organization as a whole. So a lot of what we are here doing today is part of Massy Group's ESG Flashlight journey. So engaging with relevant stakeholders is an important part of the kickoff of a journey, because it's important to ensure that all the right voices are at the table. Now, obviously, it does not mean you have to consult every stakeholder individually. However, representations from the various groups of stakeholders identified as key stakeholders for the company is very important. So beginning the dialogue with them on where they see the impact of the company's operations on people and the planet being. Again, we want to ensure at every stage of this toolkit that there is a focus on good governance practices. That is absolutely foundational to successful performance. So what does good governance look like? Here are a few factors that can be considered in ESG good governance. So we spoke a bit on resourcing. So achieving any objective in an organization requires a close assessment of what the resource needs are, what the people needs are, what the budget needs are, and what training is required in order to execute the objective successfully. So we're here today because Massy has identified that engaging with as many of the staff as possible to embark on this ESG journey with the company and with the leadership is crucial. That is all integral to corporate governance. The other thing we look at are policies, procedures, and processes. What policies are in place that address material issues identified for the company? Who's responsible for them? What are the expectations of our stakeholders? And what actions are being taken, and are those being communicated? Policies are about more than just the written word of commitment. It is also about enforcement, it's about follow-up, it's about tracking and measuring progress, and it's about continually improving using KPIs. That is a core part of an entire ESG journey when assessing environmental impact, social impact, and whether or not the policies that are in place are in fact working. So then we can look at something like an ESG management system. So because ESG is so all-encompassing across an organization, it has to involve a significant amount of cross-departmental collaboration. That collaboration needs to involve clear communication as well as involvement of key stakeholders. An ESG management system does not have to be as complex as it sounds. People, when they hear system, often think of software or very, very expensive or unwieldy and customer unfriendly sort of interfaces. It really doesn't have to be that. An ESG management system can be as simple as a series of meetings with well-documented minutes. Every company will have its own approach, And I often advise that the company deploy what already exists in the fabric of its organization. Instead of trying to reinvent the wheel for ESG, incorporate ESG into what already exists. The routine meetings that exist, the routine structures that exist, the policies that already exist, these can be amended to ensure that the E, the S, and the G principles are considered at every stage of operation and of decision-making within the company. A company also has the option to choose standards and certification. These are frameworks and guidelines that the company can use to ensure that it is on its way to achieving its objective. So whether that is an ISO standard, which I know many are familiar with, those are global international standards that are adopted in different categories to assert company performance is of a certain quality and adheres to a certain standard. There are also forms of certification where third parties come in and assess the company's performance in accordance with certain guidelines and certify the company as achieving a particular standard. These are all options available to a company that chooses to gather the relevant data that is required for these standards. So again, ESG is a very data-based approach. Now let's jump to the second tool in the toolkit, which is the tape measure. The tape measure is how you identify, measure, and assess your ESG issues. That is what we call a company's baseline. A company's baseline is where it starts its journey of data collection. So once the company has decided that it wants to understand its impact on people and the planet, it needs to begin by assessing where it is. Because only once you know where you are, you understand where you can go. So what does that involve? Again, it involves engaging the stakeholders because at every stage of this process, that will be a part of it. It will always involve a governance approach as well, ensuring that policies and regulations that exist are fit for purpose and achieving the desired objective. But what this tape measure stage is really all about is about identifying the material issues. Now, what does material mean? Material is basically understanding that not everything will affect every company in the same way. And not every company will affect people on the planet in the same way. Based on what the company does, how it operates, where it works, there's so many contextual factors to be considered. The company can identify, and really the company is the one who has to do this. Guidance from third-party consultants is advised, but the company the members of the institution will know it better than anybody else. And they will be the people that need to sit down and assess and decide what are the key ways in which we impact on people and the planet. Those are what are then termed the material issues to the company under an ESG framework. That then becomes the focus of the company's data collection. So again, we're not saying that every company has to collect data on everything all at once overnight. That's not how this works at all. And in fact, it's completely infeasible to try to do that. However, the company needs to decide where are the areas where we see we are having the most adverse impact. Let's focus on those. As a company's ESG journey matures, the company can get down into more and more detail of its impact. However, at the start of a journey, the material issues really get the most focus. So once those material issues are identified, the data that assesses the impact of those issues then has to be collected. So for example, if greenhouse gas emissions and climate change contributions are identified as a material issue for one sector of a business, that sector then needs to understand what its CO2 equivalent contribution is. That is the metric that is deployed for assessing greenhouse gas emissions. Once that's identified, the company can then set KPIs to reduce that over time and better understand its own processes to say, well, where are we emitting the most? Why are we emitting the most from those areas? And how can we do that more sustainably? So when conducting a materiality assessment, the company does what we call issue spotting. So the company takes a look at the key E, S, and G factors within its sector. And again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Many standards organizations have done this already, where they have split ESG issues by sector and said, these are the areas that this sector tends to impact on the most. Again, you need to contextualize it for us being in the Caribbean and for the company and how it operates, because not every company is the same. However, the guidelines are out there that can facilitate the conversation that people in the business who know it the best need to have in order to identify the material issues under the E and the S and the G that the company is going to address. So next we use tool number 3, which is the duct tape. The duct tape ties everything together. That is the development of the ESG strategy. Now, the ESG strategy is the product of the assessment of the material issues arising in the organization. Once those issues are identified, the company then says, what are the solutions we are going to deploy to minimize, mitigate, or eliminate the negative impact of each issue we've identified? These solutions are then formed into KPIs, and those are what the company uses to continually track and measure its progress in reducing the negative impact it's having in these material areas. Again, this is done in consultation with the key stakeholders. It is impossible to ascertain whether or not your impact on key stakeholders is reduced if you don't consult the key stakeholders. So this is what a typical strategy pyramid tends to look like. Right at the top of the pyramid is the values of the company. So again, ethics are what its beliefs are. Right below that is the vision. Where is the company going? What is it aspiring to achieve? Next is the mission. Where does the company do what it does? And what does the company do it for? This is a very purpose-driven stage of strategy development. Then we get more and more into the concrete, actionable stages. What are the strategic objectives? How is the company going to progress its mission, its vision, and its values? And lastly, the actions and KPIs are the base of the pyramid. What does the company have to do to achieve its strategic objectives, and how does it know that things are working? So this stage of the pyramid requires that every action be defined, that it have an owner and a responsible person assigned, or department perhaps, that timeframes be involved so that there is a clear target as to when the company is striving to achieve a certain objective. The resources required to achieve that action need to be deployed, and the outcomes need to be clearly defined. What are we hoping to achieve? What does success look like in relation to this key performance indicator? So as you see, the pyramid goes from very aspirational all the way down to very specific and very tangible. This is a process that companies undergo anyway. This strategic pyramid is not an ESG related pyramid. But what it is an opportunity to align your ESG objectives with the company's wider aspirations. Now, some companies choose to have a separate ESG strategy. I tend to advise against that. I tend to advise that the sustainability and ESG objectives be incorporated into the existing corporate strategy so they're one and the same. This avoids the sidelining of an ESG specific strategy, and it also avoids what we can call departmentalization of ESG. We want to ensure that ESG stays at the core of everything the operation is doing, everything the company is doing. We don't want it to get sidelined into a department where it starts to become separate from how the company runs its day-to-day operation. So the fourth tool in the toolkit is the tool belt. The tool belt is where you store all your tools. So this is what we call the ESG management system. So as I mentioned before, it does not have to be expensive software or burdensome or challenging to use. It should really sit within the fabric of what the business already deploys to manage risks in other areas. So what the goal of the management system is to assess risk. Again, this can be done at a meeting. This can be done in minutes. This can be done in reports, quarterly reports. This can be done in annual reports. But assess risk, analyze performance, and implement improvements. So the material issues have been identified, the KPIs have been defined, actions have begun. Are they working? That's basically what the ESG management system is asking, for an ongoing iterative process of assessment and improvement. So what that allows you to do is it allows you to adjust and be flexible. So if quarterly you are running an assessment of whether or not things are working as you expected or as you hoped, Where they're not, you can improve on it. You can change things. You can deploy resource more effectively, more efficiently. You can identify areas where resource is not serving its adequate purpose and could be more effectively deployed elsewhere. Again, this is how companies operate generally anyway, where budgets are assessed annually, for example, or where strategic objectives are changed, whether it's quarterly or annually as well. So this concept of regularly reviewing and benchmarking efforts is extremely integral to the success of the ongoing compliance of your strategy. So this is what it can look like in very, very simple terms. You're constantly assessing whether the material issues are the same. Businesses are living creatures, yeah? Businesses change all the time. But when those changes happen, we have to be able to recognize what the impact of that is on people and the planet. So have the material adverse impact issues changed with any given business change? Do we need to gather data on that to establish what our new baseline is? Have we identified solutions? What are our targets to achieve our goals? And how are we measuring performance? The output of this process is often reporting, the transparent disclosure to your stakeholders of what you are achieving in reducing your impact on people on the planet. So the last tool is the megaphone. That's communication and reporting. Communication is integral at every stage of the process. So I'm constantly back and forthing with myself as to whether or not it should really be tool 5, but communication needs to be interlaced in every tool. Think of a construction site where the head of the project has a megaphone on him all the time, not just at the end of the project. Throughout the project, instructions are being communicated and warnings and alerts and policies and procedures are constantly being iterated and communicated to the team. That's what this is about as well. So yes, I've put it as my 5th tool, but please think of it as an ongoing process throughout your ESG strategy deployment. What this is all about is sharing information. Sharing information on performance, sharing improvements, sharing the vision, the values, the aspirations, sharing actions taken in consideration of shareholder expectations, sharing information with regulatory bodies where that's required. Again, listed companies have certain requirements to disclose information to the general public. So what are we disclosing? How accurate is it? Do our stakeholders truly understand our operation based on the information we are providing? How can we do better? How can we give them more? How can we be accountable to them for constantly improving our impact on people and the planet? So to do this, a suitable reporting format is selected by the company based on what its material issues are, the sectors in which it operates. Again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are international organizations that have already done this for you. It's a matter of selecting the most appropriate format, engaging auditors for assurance and verification purposes, particularly important again in the listed company environment, and ensuring that reporting is regular, it's accurate, it's transparent, and it reflects the true narrative of the impact the company is having on people and the planet. Now, communication, it should kind of go without saying, but it has to be effective. The message that is intended needs to be the message that is received. And depending on the level of the organization where the communication is taking place, it will need to look quite different. So how you communicate with the board is very different to how you communicate to members of staff on a warehouse shop floor. The messaging may be the same, but how it is delivered needs to be suitable and appropriate in order for the recipient to receive the intended message. Now, the ESG journey is one that involves everyone in the company. Everyone needs to participate. Everyone needs to be on board. ESG is a culture. ESG is a way of working to be embraced by all. So communications teams are integral to the successful deployment of an ESG framework in an organization. So here are some examples of the standards and reporting organizations that I mentioned. As you see, there are several, but what the global community has come together and said in the wake of COP26 is they said, we need one. We need one global standard that can be applied across the board to give us the opportunity to provide comparable information. That is where the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, was born. We are still awaiting the output from ISSB of what that global unifying report is going to look like. However, that is what the global community is working towards, and that is what a lot of regulation across the world is going to be based on. So it's very important that we keep our eye on that, because that is what is going to set the pace for everything that is to come. So ongoing compliance and accountability, what does that look like? Well, as we said, ESG is a very data-based approach. So there needs to be a constant and continual focus on data, both its collection, its storage, its management, and again, cybersecurity, ensuring that stakeholder trust is maintained by protecting that data at all costs. It's also important to understand the criteria for compliance. So as we said, we're not a regulated environment now, but if a company is looking to do a lot more work in the United States, for example, it needs to understand what compliance looks like there. How do we operate in compliance with United States law, be it state or federal, in this space at this time with this operation? Those questions need to be asked constantly as a company grows and evolves. The company should also develop pretty robust operational metrics and management systems for rolling out this ESG framework. So once those material issues are identified, the company needs to spend a little time understanding how do we best understand the impact we are having in these material areas? What are the metrics we're using? What are the techniques we're deploying to gather that information? How are we assessing that information? And how are we ensuring that that information is constantly kept up to date? That's where the management system also comes into play. Ongoing compliance also requires progressively aggressive KPIs. So KPIs that really achieve the strategic objectives set by the company, that are constantly updated to keep a very ambitious and challenging progressive approach to improvement. That is what keeps the values and the vision of the company truly alive. It is the substance behind the aspirations. Transparent verification and audit processes, again, particularly important for publicly traded companies. This is where you ensure data integrity. Now, anybody can say they've collected data, but how do we know that data is accurate? How do we know it's valid? How do we know it means what the company says it means? This is where third-party verification is really crucial. So again, this may come from auditors, this may come from third-party certification bodies, this may come from credit risk agencies. There are several ways that that data can be verified and data assurance can be provided. But it is really integral, again, for stakeholder trust. Can the general public and the stakeholders involved trust the information being reported by the company? Meeting disclosure requirements. So again, listed companies are going to see this before the rest of the private sector, but what you're going to see is that stock exchanges are going to come in and start saying, hey, we want to hear more about what you're doing from a sustainability perspective. We're hearing rumblings of that across the Caribbean already. So we're hearing other stock exchanges in Jamaica, in Barbados, really starting to have these conversations around what will become mandatory disclosures for publicly listed companies in this space. And lastly, for anything to continue, it needs to be appropriately resourced. So the company constantly needs to assess, look, what is the resource requirement for actually operationalizing our ESG? How do we embed this into our organization and make it work? What do we need in order to successfully do that? So what are some of the stumbling blocks that companies come across and where they fall over on their ESG journeys? We've touched on many of these already, but just to recap, greenwashing. So where we market the good and we omit the bad. Again, in the era of such freely available information and access to information and a new generation of very, very curious and inquisitive customers and employees and stakeholders, companies need to ensure that they are not simply marketing, that they actually can substantiate what they are marketing. Reporting and due diligence, again, this is a data integrity point. There's no easier way than to lose the public trust than to deceive, whether intentional or inadvertent. If the stakeholder feels deceived, trust is lost. So data integrity, reporting, and due diligence is extremely important to this process. Sidelining governance, again, not one I'm particularly concerned about with Massy, that has governance at front of mind at all times, but again, it's very, very important to ensure that the structures in place from a governance perspective, how the company makes decisions, is bearing the ESG principles in mind. Is the leadership representative of the stakeholder body? Is it reflective of the stakeholder expectations and considerations? All of these are questions involved in good governance practices. Cybersecurity, again, data, data, data. We live in a world where we can't do without it, but it is a huge risk to hold it. It's very, very important that every company considers cybersecurity at the forefront of good governance. And lastly, continuing as you began. I can't tell you how many times I've seen companies start off very, very hot and sweaty on their ESG journey, very keen to get things started, and 2 years down the line, it tapers off. So ongoing compliance and accountability is extremely important. An ESG journey cannot happen overnight. It does not happen overnight. After the decision has been made is when the hard work really begins. You can sort of think of it a bit like a marriage. So that comes to the end of my presentation. I'm going to hand over, I believe, to Audra and Anjan to lead in the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. That was so informative and very comprehensive, and I know I've certainly learned a lot from what you shared. So, on this note, we're going to continue. We're going to begin our discussions, right? So we're going to get into our Q&A, and I would invite any of the panelists to jump in. You know, even if one panelist is sharing, you know, you're welcome to jump in to add to that. And I just want to remind you, our attendees, you know, go ahead and feel free to post your questions. We're all on a learning journey here, so any question that you post, you know, all of us will learn from it. So to begin our Q&A, I will start with Anjan. So Anjan, as our Chief Risk Officer, and based on what Rachel shared, and even based on the research you've been doing and reading, you know, what does ESG look like through your lens?
ESG looks like opportunity. I have to admit I'm really passionate about ESG. I see it as an opportunity for us to express our purpose, first of all. You know, when we said that we updated our purpose, our mission statement, a global force for good, then the questions around ESG became very, very obvious. If we are a global force for good, Caribbean hearts, living our values, and I don't know if we can get some of them in the back here, then there's an opportunity to express that, and I see ESG as the vehicle that we can use to do that. It's an opportunity to level up our CSR philanthropy, our nudge activities, as Rachel mentioned. The difference between ESG and all these really great things that we have been leaders in the Caribbean space, it's an opportunity to integrate it into the business. So I see that as a challenge for us to measure the impact and then bring it back into the business and turn it into even more. So we can squeeze more value out of what we do, and that comes back to the communities that we impact. I see it as an opportunity to update our ERM, our Enterprise Risk Management Framework. I think of ESG think of it as a wave that's coming, and some of our businesses are on the shore and some of our businesses are on the mountain. So I think of some portfolios really at the forefront of experiencing that ESG wave, and they're really doing a lot of activities to get the information to respond to that. And some of our portfolios are further back, so they have an opportunity to evaluate, see what this means for them from both a risk perspective and an opportunity perspective. And once it's identified as a critical or principal risk, then a whole host of activity springs forward, and that's incorporated into the Enterprise Risk Management Framework. So ESG is a vehicle. It's a vehicle for us to express our purpose, and it's also an opportunity for us to mature as an organization.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Anjan. And I love that, an opportunity, right? I love that fact that you also said it looks like our purpose and living our values. So I want to ask you one other question, a follow-up question to that. So based on what you've just shared, should companies include ESG risks in their company risks? Should they begin to start to think about that and put that in?
So I'll go back to that analogy, that image of ESG as a wave. So very early on, we flagged ESG as an emerging risk. So we saw that systemically across all organizations. It's going to impact everyone. Why? Well, climate change is impacting everyone. It impacts us in Barbados. Mia Motley has been at the forefront in speaking to the world on how climate change is impacting her country and wider to Caribbean region, which means every company, every organization in Barbados is feeling that impact. So that's what we call systemic risk. Think of the weather patterns in Trinidad, where we're getting continuous rain for a whole season that's outside of the rainy season. What that means from a business continuity perspective, what that means in terms of higher insurance claims, what that means in terms of workers being able to come out and come to work. So it is having an impact on our business. Some organizations in the group are more at the forefront. So their bankers are saying, if we want to finance this new initiative or this new transaction, we want to see your ESG credentials. So those organizations, they're on the show. ESG is already a critical risk, and they are putting things in place to respond to that. So I see, yes, we can't escape putting ESG in our risk register. How that looks for every company is going to be different. For some, it's going to be a principal or critical risk. For others, it might be, this is a risk at every organization. It's systemic. As we start to get into an ESG framework and really assess our impact on the environment and the cost of that, as we impact cybersecurity, so that's an element that's already in Massy's. We don't call it ESG, we call it cybersecurity, but it's now part of the ESG framework. So we don't get to escape this. We do have an opportunity to decide how we respond to it in a way that really shouts our purpose and in a way that helps us to really capture all the opportunities it brings as well.
Great, thanks so much for that, Ange. And I remember reading, an article that spoke about, when companies that are, I guess, more forward, and this is more on a global stage in terms of ESG, really make their decisions around which companies they invest in due to whether they see ESG being included or being a part of the fabric of the organization, So thanks for that, Ange. So I want to bring Wendy in at this point. Wendy, can you share with us what do you see as the role of the board in ESG? Is there a role that they play, and what does this look like?
Yes, the board is responsible for, or I'd say has oversight for ensuring that ESG matters are incorporated into purpose, governance, strategy. Rachel spoke about, her recommendation of, making sure that ESG is not set up in a separate department, that it's actually integrated into the company's strategy. The board has oversight for, ESG matters being incorporated into decision-making at all levels of the organization, risk management, reporting. Anjan spoke of ESG as systemic risk. And, when the board is doing its strategy planning, it must consider systemic risk because it must plan for it. How do we mitigate it? How do we insure against it? How do we deal with it? And it can come in the impact of that can come in so many different forms. So the board has a huge part to play in leadership and in setting the tone for what ESG will be throughout the organization.
Great. Thank you for that, Wens. And we have a comment and then a question from Astor, right? So comment is, ESG is a framework that has integrated a number of past models environmental consciousness, sustainability, business continuity, and social responsibility into the framework. So the question is, what will we be doing differently to ensure that ESG is embedded into our strategic plan, to ensure it is duly considered after the hype has died down? I don't know, between Wendy or Anjan, you'd like to comment?
Wendy, do you want?
What I can say is it will have to take place in stages to be embedded in our strategy. So I think Rachel spoke about the integration of risk and strategy. I think the entire process will start with, and this is what's different, the group coming together, the executive, key staff members, or our employees across the group might be seeing something, coming together and brainstorming and getting clarity around what are our key material risks, what are our key ESG risks. And I think how that then becomes cascaded across the organization once we identify the strategies around that. I mean, it has to be aligned with your purpose. ESG has to be aligned with your strategies. I think it's then cascaded into the organization in an operational way by setting targets, in KPIs and targets, I think at an individual level in people's scorecards, so that we can measure it in terms of what we are doing about it. And then that will filter into the reporting on, against the key ESG risks that we have identified. That's how I see it living in the organization as we go forward, and that's what will be different. The actual implementation of that framework and the tracking of the successes, the gaps, and the evolution of it as it unfolds, right? So we're at a stage where we're building awareness around it. I think there's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot that we do know, but we're still in the process of bringing that understanding together. And Jen, I'm not sure if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I like Asta's question. ESG is a different kind of risk. It's big. As I said, it's systemic. We can't escape it, certainly from the environmental perspective. We can't escape it because it's involving in the social aspect, the Me Too, inequality. As Rachel mentioned, it has been flagged as critical risks by the World Economic Forum. So this is not one we can avoid. And then it's very complex because it shows up in many layers: financial, regulatory. From a regulatory perspective, we can't avoid having a response to ESG. So it will be a requirement, a reporting requirement. And as Wendy pointed out, our board charters have been updated to recognize ESG as a critical component. So I think Massy has already taken steps, small steps, but really important foundational steps to ensure that ESG is becoming part of our governance framework. And I like Wendy's use of CARE because it mixes up all the letters E, S, and G. The governance has already started to be addressed in the formulation of policy at the board level. In some portfolios, like the gases portfolio, we are including it in our ERM framework. So that's the nuts and bolts. There is a risk that it can become a compliance activity and not embedded in strategy. So that's where I see ESG as an opportunity. So when we start seeing the gains that we can make by aligning it to strategy and aligning it to purpose, that's where it becomes really exciting and it gets a stickiness to it. So that's where we really have a lot of work, all employees, managers, to see the upside of ESG so that we're crying out to do business differently. That's what ESG represents, an opportunity to live our purpose, but do business differently.
Great. Thanks again, Anjan and Wendy. So we have a question. This one is from anonymous attendee, and the question is this: is there a communication matrix for Massy's ESG strategy that Massy's involvement, progress, and big picture can be kept alive at varying levels of the varying organizations within the group. So varying levels of the varying organizations within the group.
I'd like to take a stab at that to
Sure.
start. So we're part of that communication matrix. There is an overall shared with Susan Hamill-Smith, who is with us. When we said that we want to take the first steps in an ESG strategy, we did have a communication plan that is really aligned to the stage where we're at in that ES journey. And that stage right now is awareness. So the communication of workshops, the communication of what is happening, what other companies are doing in the group, that's where we are now. And as we become more mature, then that matrix is going to evolve. In some portfolios where it is more mature, we'd see a more mature communication matrix. So I think the complexity of that matrix evolves as we progress in our ESG journey.
Okay, thanks, Anjan. So we have another question, again by anonymous attendee. Will there be balanced reporting on ESG? That is, not only on what we have done well, but the shortfall as well. Example, the recent accident in the group where an employee died.
Jen, you or me?
Yes, there will be reporting. Reporting is the final stage in that framework. But we don't report on issues like what happened in the group only as part of an ESG framework. ESG asks us to report in a certain way, but because of who we are, we do that reporting on incidents like that anyway. So our communication on where we have done well and where we haven't, I think has to be informed by our values. ESG asks for it to be reported in a specific way. And I just want to take time to really express the sorrow that we all feel on the accident. We are taking steps in the group to complete the reporting that is ongoing right now. And certainly, as we do as a Massy employer, we are taking steps to support and comfort the family and everyone impacted in that incident.
Okay, thanks for that, Anjan. So I want to now pose a question to, I'm going to pose a question to Rachel. So Rachel, what does the timeline look like for implementing an ESG framework?
Unfortunately, I'm going to give the answer that everyone hates hearing from the lawyer, which is it depends. But it largely depends on the amount of resource the company deploys at any given time towards the journey, the level of the commitments that are made. Obviously, the commitments that are more substantive will take far longer to achieve. But I think it is safe to say that a company is on its ESG journey when its leadership has turned its mind to it and communicated this to the organization. That's when the journey begins. There's really no ending to the journey, right? Because find me a single company on this planet that has no negative impact on people on the planet from how it's making money, right? That's just not where we are, particularly because let's start with the fact that we are still a global fossil fuel-based economy, globally. Energy is derived from fossil fuels, still, with a large predominance. So really and truly, there's always work to be done. So I would not put a timeline on things in the sense of there being an ending. There shouldn't be a perceived ending. This is an ongoing journey. As long as the company is alive, it should be striving to do better in any way that it can. That being said, The actions and KPIs that I described, those have timeframes. So once strategic objectives are set, the company can communicate a timeline in relation to those. And that is something that it will want to hold itself out to be doing, because that is what is providing substance to its assertions that we are actively taking ESG into account at this company, and here's how. So when it comes to timelines, I think the timeline that should really be focused on is the timeline on defined actions, as opposed to the timeline on the concept of ESG being something that has a start and a finish. Hope that's helpful.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much, Rachel. Because one of the questions I also had was, and I do agree in terms of what you said, that it really is sort of specific to the company and based on, we have some things in place, it's how we integrate it. So I guess another way I wanted to ask the question, or another thought around it, is that, so how would a company know whether they're, I guess, progressing or lagging, particularly as this is something that's moving ahead globally?
So there are several ways that can be done. First is the company can go through a benchmarking exercise. What benchmarking does is it says, what companies are out there, often in the global north, but what companies are out there doing similar operations to us here in the Caribbean, and how are they choosing to report their behavior? What is their data saying? What are the material issues that they have encountered? That benchmarking process is a very valuable exercise, because again, ESG is not about reinventing the wheel, right? So it's about just gaining a better understanding. And the start to that journey is really understanding what information is already out there that could feed into your decision making in your ESG journey. So benchmarking is a really valuable first step to understanding where your material issues lie and how you can start taking steps in a direction to improve your impact in those areas.
Great, thank you for that, Rachel. So I'm going to go back again, and I'm really happy to see that our attendees are posting their questions and thoughts. Really love that. So Asta, thanks again. Asta is saying this is an excellent program on a great forum, but in taking a first stab in the arena of change management, using the tool ADKAR, sorry, one second, it just moved off. Using the tool ADKAR, I'm coming to that, right. How will we send a message of ESG using ADKAR to reach all levels? Amjen?
I guess as the change management
yes,
practitioner,
yes.
that one's for me.
That's clearly in your,
and thank you, Asta, for giving a plug for change management. So for those of you who are not aware of what ADKAR means, it is the 5-step milestone through which we achieve sustainable change. First, through awareness of the need to change, and then creating a desire to commit to that change, then giving tools to build knowledge, performance, KPIs to make sure we can assess progress, and then reinforcement with incentives at the end. So that's what ADKAR, ADKAR. So we are at the first stage, awareness, and this webinar where we're partnering with MLI is the first stage in that journey. Some portfolios have had maybe about 3 or 4 of these awareness building sessions, and we know from our research that it takes maybe 6 to 10 attempts. So we have to continue throughout this year more and more opportunities to build awareness, to have the great questions that we've been seeing today. Have that sit with people, and then hopefully they can start asking questions like, what next can we do? And that's a signal that there is a readiness to take the next step to action, which is what Rachel mentioned. If you remember in Rachel's slide, she said communication. It's the 5th key tip or in the toolkit. But really communication is weaved right throughout the entire process. So we're at the first stage, Asta. We are building awareness through this webinar. There will be more to come. And we're going to try to bring new information. I'm hoping that the next one talks about what are some of the things that we are already starting in Massy. Wendy mentioned a couple of them. We are taking initiatives that can fit very nicely into an ESG framework. And that's what we want to build awareness around next. So there will be more to come. And when people start indicating with their hands up, yes, I'm ready to do more, we know we've passed the next step of our ADCAR journey. Great question.
Great, thanks, Anjan. So yes, as Anjan just said, we're at the early stages of this journey. So our next question, again, it's coming from an anonymous attendee. So, will ESG be a part of performance assessments moving forward? So Anjan and Wendy, what do you think as we look at the beginning of this journey? Any thoughts on this?
I believe so. I believe it has to be, because it will live in the organization. It will be integrated into strategy. So as we roll out strategy, which will incorporate ESG, it has to.
Great, thanks for that, Wendy. So I'm going to pose this follow-up question to you as well, that Anjan and or Rachel can jump in. Will ESG reporting be mandatory in Trinidad and Tobago?
It is very likely that we will begin to see ESG related reporting becoming mandatory, but I think it is safe to say that it will be very slow burn. It is unlikely to come in its first iteration as a comprehensive approach like Europe has taken under their Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is requiring disclosures on the EBS and the G. It is much more likely that we will see a trend emerging like what is coming out of North America, where there are thematic areas that are selected of material importance to the nation, for example, climate change and greenhouse emissions. We are likely to see mandatory reporting starting there. But as I indicated in the presentation, it is also very likely that that starts with publicly listed companies before it hits the wider private sector.
Great. Thanks for that, Rachel. And I'm going to keep you on the spot a little bit because I want to ask you this follow-up question. So, you know, as we have employees that are here attending and those who will be listening to this afterwards, how can persons get involved? You know, for employees or companies, you know, if somebody must be sitting down here thinking, how do I get involved in this? You know, what's my role? What would you say to them?
I would say that question is music to my ears to start. And it is music to any company's ears to hear its employees say, how do I get involved? Because the first step really is, as Anjan said, we need participation, we need engagement. Everything cannot happen at the board level. So my first answer to that is, thanks for asking. And the substantive answer is, have a think about what you do in the organization. What is your role, right? Think about what you do and the impact of what you do. Yeah? Think about, okay, what sector am I in? What do we do as a sector? What area am I involved in? What does my department do as a department, right? Have a think about, first of all, your role in the organization, and ask the question at each stage, what is the impact on the environment and what is the impact on people of what we are doing here? Because you are integral to the company understanding where the material issues lie. You who deal with the third-party suppliers, the supply chain as a whole, the customers, your colleagues, your work environment, much more directly than your board of directors ever will, right? You actually hold the key to understanding the material issues. You hold the key to engaging with the material issues and understanding ways that they can be addressed. So really and truly, you doing that deep dive yourself, the company is reliant on your knowledge, your expertise, and your participation in order to get this right. So I think the first step for a company to do a company-wide introspection, individuals, departments, teams should do a team introspection. So let me encourage you here, next team meeting you have, ask the question to your team. How is what we're doing impacting people and the planet in any adverse way? And can we think together about ways that we can start to reduce that? You don't have to wait for frameworks and structures to come from the top for you to begin to think about these things, to begin to consider ways that you can optimize your operation for the betterment of people and the planet. You really do have far more power than your board in this realm. And I do apologize to any board members on the call. You are also very key people. But I really have to say there is nothing more powerful than an engaged employee when it comes to an ESG framework.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. So as we were winding down, I just want to ask if panelists Is there anything they'd like to say in closing? Any quick comment in closing? I'll start with Anjan.
This is really exciting, being able to have this forum to formalize our starting gun on ESG. I'm looking forward to more coming at the portfolio and at the corporate level. And certainly I'm heartened to hear the first sign of a D question, the desire to actually take on action. I'm challenging everyone. Think about what you do. Think about ideas where Massy can be doing more. And challenge us, bring that information to Wendy, to Audra, to your manager and say, listen, I think these are ideas that will align to our purpose and really fit what I understand about ESG. And then ask for more information on ESG. We really want you to help us go on this journey with the best intention possible.
Great, thank you, Anjan. Rachel?
So we all have a sphere of influence, yeah? In a professional sphere, we have those we work with, those who report to us, those we report to. These are people we are in constant communication with. What I challenge you all to do is take what you've gleaned from this session here, whatever you deem to be of material importance to your job, to your team, something concrete that can be actionable. I encourage you to share it with at least 5 people in your sphere of influence. People who were not able to attend today, have the conversation, start the dialogue. It all has to start somewhere and with someone, and one of the most powerful things you can do in an organization is discuss the issues that matter. So I encourage you all to please have these conversations in the aftermath of this session. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate. I've really enjoyed myself today.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And Wendy?
I don't think that this session could have ended on a better note. And really to see, Rachel reinforcing for us, what we believe in and supporting us on this journey has been great. Having Anjan on this journey, as a partner, a thought partner, agreeing, disagreeing over time has been great. But the invitation to the Massy employees now to co-create this with us is huge, because this is our journey and we can't do it without you. So thanks to everyone.
Thank you so much, Wendy. So on this note, we've come to the end of what has really been an informative session. And I hope like me, you've all learned a bit more about ESG and heard our call to you, our call to action, for you to start to think about it and really play your role in helping this be integrated in the organization. So I would like to thank our panelists for joining us today. Thanks to our technical team, Smart Vibrations, and my MLI team, without whom this would not have been possible. We want to thank you, our attendees, for joining and being a part of this with us. We look forward to seeing you at our other webinars, our other programs. You can visit our website, www.massylearninginstitute.com, to find out more about our programs and our offerings, and again, where you'll see a recording of this session. As we close, we want to remind you to keep leveling up. Bye, everybody. Take care.
So grateful for your sunshine. I feel a movement taking over. Lean on me, you'll be alright. When I need you, I'll find your shoulder.
When I see me, this is magic guarantee. Can you feel it?
Can you feel it? Yeah.
From your soul to the world, long road, come let's go.
Just believe.